AMaGA Victoria respectfully acknowledges the first people of the land on which we make this podcast, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. We would like to acknowledge that museums, galleries and other arts and cultural organisations within Victoria sit on unceded lands. This is Closer Look, a podcast by AMaGA Victoria. I'm Maria Pia Dunne.
Come on, man. You can do it.
Jump. I don't know what you're supposed to do there. Like go down?
You're just meant to memorise.
I guess so. Hello and welcome to another episode of Closer Look. So we've actually taken a bit of a hiatus, you probably have noticed, and this is because we've actually had some very exciting news. So we have in fact moved offices from the Royal Exhibition Building to now being in the ACMI X offices in Federation Square. So we've had a bit of a whirlwind of doing a lot of different things and getting our bearings right with moving offices. But what has been really lovely is that we've thought that this would be a perfect opportunity to have the theme of this episode be movement, and the idea of movement in so many different ways and how museums and galleries reflect on movement as a term. So in this episode, we actually interviewed Fiona Trigg, who's the Senior Curator at ACMI, to talk a bit more about the permanent exhibition, and we do a little bit of a look into the exhibition. And then we also talked to Erin Jamieson, who is the Education Coordinator at the National Trust of Australia that looks after the Pollywoodside site. So this area is all about kind of shadow and puppetry and the different ways in which different people have told stories through shadows. We are exploring ACMI's permanent exhibition, The Story of the Moving Image, that journeys through the past, present and future of the moving image with interactive experiences. Pieces don't have things written down often. It often has touchscreens next to them and you can see what the context is of those things, which kind of means that you can look at something and have not much of context of it and then you click on it and get more context as you go through the space.
My name is Fiona Trigg and I'm one of the Senior Curators at ACMI. We're responsible for the exhibition spaces, so that's ongoing free exhibition called The Story of the Moving Image and all of our temporary exhibition. ACMI is based around film. We grew out of a film organisation that was founded in the 1940s, the State Film Centre, who had the remit to make film available to the people of Victoria. So we had a big lending library and films were transported all around the state to libraries and schools and community groups. And then ACMI has developed into the organisation it is now over the subsequent years, and our current building was built in 2002, opened in 2002, and we continue to exhibit film, but Moving Image now incorporates television, video games, social media. It's becoming really ubiquitous. So I guess ACMI's remit is to constantly look at the ever-changing dance between the technology of moving image and the content and the audience, and to look at how all of those things relate and what are the innovations in technology and what impact does that have on the way that people look at moving image, the way they use it, the way they make it, and the kinds of moving images that are produced in our culture.
What are the kind of conversations that you're having with your team when choosing between an interactive display and a non-interactive one?
It's a constant struggle with museums, not just I'm sure at ACMI, but I'm sure many museums, in that you want to have displays and exhibits that are very accessible, that people feel really welcome to engage with and to touch and to play with where appropriate, but you also are showing some really precious and rare objects that by their nature can't really be touched. So it's a constant sort of juggle to try to get that balance right. We have quite a young audience and we show a lot of things like video games, which by their nature are interactive. So we build into a lot of our exhibits, especially in the story of the moving image, but in every show that we do, we try to see where is it possible for the audience to be able to interact and engage. You know, when you have a bunch of school kids running through, the first thing they want to do is push buttons, touch everything. And so we try to make meaningful experiences and displays where people can learn and discover more about the content that we're showing through engaging with it and interacting with it. But yes, at the same time, we might be showing a beautiful costume that can't be touched because it'll be destroyed. So it's an ongoing challenge, but part of the fun is trying to build that language into the shows that we make, where it becomes clear to visitors that, yeah, you can play with this, you can create something here, you can make something with this display, but over here, please don't touch this fragile costume from the 1930s because it will fall apart in your hands. So yes, it's part of the nature of the job is trying to navigate that line between offering people something that they can actually do and offering people things that they can just look at and not actually touch.
We decided to test out some of the interactive areas of the exhibition. Myself and Ciara Griffiths, project officer at AMaGA Victoria, certified gamer, spent quite a bit of time on the infamously hard 1983 Dragon's Lair. I'm really bad at this
Press
game.
sword. There's a reason why you're bad at this game.
Yeah. Whoops. Thank you. Quite a powerful part of the story of the moving image is the room where it showcases documentary and non-fiction, and it has more of a political edge to it. How did you go about navigating that?
You could do a massive, endless exhibition, really, about news and documentary footage and the impact that's had and continues to have in our culture. That's a section of the exhibition called Moving Minds, and it looks at the history and the tradition and the power of moving image to be used in news and documentary. So it's about how things that can be filmed and then shown to an audience can change people's opinions about politics and can record significant events. So we've got content in that section that's everything from key news moments that are sort of burned into our collective memory. The 10 embassy protests in Canberra. We also have a section looking at the work done by the Cancer Council in trying to encourage people not to smoke through their cigarette ads. So it's a big range of content, but it's all about sort of news and documentary and how those stories can have a really significant influence on the way our society sees itself. So I guess it was a pretty tricky task for the curators who worked on putting that section together in the first instance to make a selection. So trying to, I guess, select some key events that stood in for the whole history of that kind of footage. Yeah, you're never going to be able to be comprehensive, so you have to try and pick out some really key, interesting events of different kinds and tell the little story of those and make a really clear snapshot and hope that gives our visitors a sense of the deeper histories.
How do you choose between presenting Australian content and international content in your collections?
We show a lot of Australian content in the story of the moving image. We have a dedicated section to Australian content and, of course, a really strong First Nations stream of content, both in that exhibition and across our whole programming. We commission a lot of Australian contemporary artists to make new work, and we're really proud of that record that we have. Of course, we're excited to be able to bring international content to Melbourne audiences as well. But getting that balance right, it's like getting the balance right across any programming stream. We love to showcase emerging Australian talent, but also put it in the context of the best that's being made around the world.
Walking down the Yarra from ACMI, Pollywoodside stands out of place from the Melbourne cityscape. It is an old wooden 19th century ship that moved cargo and people through the seas, that now you can literally stand on as part of this historical site.
Yeah. So I think the thing about Pollywoodside, when compared to some of the other places that we have at the National Trust, is that Pollywoodside wasn't the destination. It was the journey for many people. Especially in the early days, Pollywoodside was a merchant cargo ship. So it was really about getting from A to B and not about the journey itself. It was about the destination, which was, where you drop off the cargo.
I'm speaking with Erin Jamieson, Education Coordinator at the National Trust. What do you think people take the most from visiting a site like Pollywoodside?
Yeah. So I find that people love hearing about stories that they can relate to in some way. So with Pollywoodside, obviously not many of us have lived aboard a ship before, so it is quite foreign to many of us. But one thing that I find that people young and old like to know about is everyday life. So things as simple as what people used to eat for breakfast, lunch and dinner, even things like toilets. They love hearing about toilets and where people went. Things like work conditions and just life aboard, so where people slept, where they kept their stuff, because it's experiences like that that people can relate to in some way. And I find they're the most valuable stories to tell because it shows that, back in the day, these people that are now just names in history books actually lived lives and lived very similarly to many of us.
What I find quite interesting is it's one of those, it's a ship that you can actually board, so you can be part of that history in some ways.
Yeah, for sure. And there's so many echoes of the past on board. One of my favourite things is actually in the deck house, so on board the ship, where the able-bodied seamen and the ordinary seamen would sleep of a night time. And it says, "Growl you may, but go you must." And it just sort of really echoes the life on board was quite challenging, so even if you growl, you still have to go to work every day. And there was no getting away from that work when you're living on board.
So could you tell me a little bit about the history of Pollywoodside?
Yeah, so Pollywoodside was launched in 1885 by William Woodside. He was a ship owner. He owned many ships. We always say that he got 3 ships for his 21st birthday, so he was a very lucky man. And Pollywoodside was actually named for his wife. Her name was Marion, but he already had a Marion, as I said, lots of ships, so he named it Polly, which was her nickname. And at first, she mainly sailed from Europe around to South America, and in doing so, Pollywoodside had to go around Cape Horn, which is one of the most notorious sort of areas of ocean there is. The conditions there are absolutely atrocious. Sailors who made it around Cape Horn successfully actually wore it as a badge of honour. They could get a special tattoo, they could wear an earring in a certain ear. It was sort of a real thing to say, hey, I'm a really good sailor because I made it around Cape Horn. And Polly managed to do that 16 times in her time running that route. She was a cargo ship and her main export was coal, which she would take to South America, and then on the way back it would be often guano, which is very disgustingly bird poo. And on board there would be a crew of around 15 to 20 odd sailors, from the ship's boy, which would be the youngest person on board, sometimes as young as 12 years old, all the way up to the captain at the top. So it was a very hierarchical society and predominantly men in those early days. But we do have a story of later on, 1900s, of a sailor captain who brought his wife and daughter along on board with him as well. I think it's a really nice story. In 1904, Woodside was sold to a New Zealand shipping company and renamed the Rona. Then from then on, she sailed from Australia to New Zealand and back, same sort of cargo shipping, until eventually sailing ships were used out in steamboats over sailing ships. So 1920, Rona was started, and big coal hulk would be basically a coal ship barge thing that would deliver coal up the Yarra River to steamships, so her successors. At that time, I find it really interesting that the family that lived on board Pollywoodside were the Gardner family. So Peter, the father, he was the lighterman, so that was his job to ship the coal around, and he lived on board with Margaret, his wife, and 8 children. So they lived on board in the 1920s and 30s, and it would have been a very interesting time to live aboard a ship. There was no stability in that life. There's stories that the children tell of, they'd go off to school one day, they'd just go to the nearest school, whatever school that was. At the end of the day, they'd ride their along the banks of the Yarra River to try and find the ship because they didn't know where it would be at the end of the day. There is also stories that say that even though there was no power, they were always warm because, of course, they had plenty of coal. In 1943, they would for a time to go off to be in the naval service. She went over to Papua New Guinea and did a very similar job over there, refuelling other vessels. And she survived and she came back. The Gardner family retook up residence on board for a little while, but eventually coal lost favour as well. Woodside was just left to rest in the Yarra River. And yeah, in 1968, the National Trust came into the story when one saw Polly Woodside for what she really was, one of the last examples of that kind of sailing ship in the world. One sent to the National Trust, and the story doesn't end there. Say is, when we a custodianship of a property, that story isn't ending, it's just continuing on. In the years that followed, there was apparently around 60,000 hours of volunteer labour given to return Pollywoodside to glory days of the 1800s. And she's still out there to this day.
What I'm also curious about is, where was it found? Like, was it just on the Yarra River? Was it just...
Yeah, so it was basically just a rusty old cold barge. But someone looked at it and thought, hey, I see sort of like little bits of mast sticking up. And they looked at the shape of it and everything, and they realised what they were looking at was actually something quite special.
Yeah, and what do you think is the significance of the ship for Melbourne's history?
Yeah, so Pollywoodside represents a part of Melbourne's history that is somewhat forgotten. So I was looking at some old pictures of sort of that South Bank area, and nowadays it's very cosmopolitan, very modern, there's entertainment venues and a lot of restaurants and things down there. But even 50 years ago, it was an industrial area, and Pollywoodside and many ships like that were coming up and down that river to deliver cargo. To this day, cargo is a very important part of Melbourne's story, of the world's story. A huge amount of what we have in our lives has come to us via ship. Even though it's not as apparent in the Melbourne landscape anymore, she's very significant to Melbourne's story as one of the last remaining ships of her kind. I think there's only 10 known examples of a ship like Polly left in the world.
So with your role in education, What are the things that, I guess, are there any questions that children always ask you in regards to?
Yes. So a lot of the questions that children ask, a little bit silly, but also I think really enlightening to what they think about when they see a ship like Pollywoodside. The biggest one is, how did she move? In this day of modern technology, using wind power is something that a lot of kids maybe don't understand fully. But also out in the middle of the ocean, how did the captain know where they were? There was no Google Maps. So a big part of what we do is introduce students to the technologies that we use aboard sailing ships. So something as basic as a log line, which is literally a big stick on a bit of rope that you throw over the side of the ship, and it's got knots in the rope, and how fast the knots go over the edge of the ship indicate how many knots the ship is travelling at, so the speed at which the ship is travelling at. That's where that term comes from. And also things like, sextants and chronometers and compasses and all these different bits of technology that use the elements around you to identify location. So using the sun and the moon and the stars as coordinates to work out where you are in the world. It was an incredible skill to understand your position on a ship back in the day.
I feel like you discussing all of the technology, it's made me realise how much ships were quite the new technology, They were the investment of the rich people in in previous times.
Yeah, big time. So, ships were the lifeblood of society for a very long time, and, by the 1800s, in Australia, people were relying on ships coming in to deliver things that weren't being produced in Australia. Especially in the early days, there just wasn't that sort of industry set up in Australia, so everything was being brought in. And, people depended on these ships coming in and being on time as well. They'd be able to somewhat indicate when they were going to arrive somewhere, but I think that's probably why steamships were a bit better, because they could sort of say, hey, we're going to be there on this day in particular.
That's all the time we have for Closer Look. A huge thanks to Fiona Trigg and Erin Jamieson for their insights on both the moving image and the moving ship for this episode. Ongoing, Closer Look will be publishing 2 episodes a year. Our next episode will be at the end of year holidays, so you can get some of your summer listens in. Pollywoodside is open on the 1st and 3rd Sundays of each month. ACMI is open 10 to 5 every day except Christmas Day. ACMI is also where our new offices are, and we look forward to receiving more visitors in the coming months. The sound mixing and recording of this episode has been done by me, Maria Pia Dunne, and the music for this podcast is by Oleg Fedak from Pixabay. This is Closer Look.